Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Bonnie Clearwater. I'm the Director and Chief Curator of the Museum of Contemporary Art in North Miami. And we have the distinction of being the last conversation for Art Basel 2012. I'm so glad to have with me today Hernan Bas, who is an extraordinary artist and someone that I've known since the beginning of his career. So it's been so nice to be able to catch up. You know, at MoCA in North Miami, we've been showing the young Miami artists so early in their career that they're still young Miami artists. However, Hernan has moved on from Miami, although he's also going to be here part-time, which is wonderful. Here is a Miami native. He's born in Miami, graduated New World School of the Arts. He had his first museum show in 1999 at MoCA North Miami in Making Art in Miami, Travels in Hyperreality. His first solo museum show was also at MoCA in North Miami in 2002. That's really hard to believe how long that ago.
It does not seem like that long ago at all.
And that show was called It's Supernatural, which we'll get back to because it relates a lot to what you're doing now. He showed at the Moore space, which was Rosa de la Cruz's space in the Design District. Rebel Collection organized a major exhibition of his, of works in their collection that went to the Brooklyn Museum. And most recently, he had a comprehensive exhibition. We don't want to call it a retrospective at this point.
I'm too young.
At the Kunstverein in Hanover, Germany. He's also been in the Whitney Biennial, and he's represented by many galleries all over the world, including here in Miami, his first gallery, Fred Snitzer, who's here with us today. He also shows at Victoria Moreau in London, Lehman Malpin in New York, Periton in Paris, and I'm missing somebody.
Peter Kelchman in Zurich.
In Zurich. So he's got almost the whole...
Oh, and he went to Periton in Paris.
And Periton, so he's got basically most of the world covered.
Yeah,
to think it started here in Miami. You know, so much of your early work, Hernan, is about growing up in Miami and the sort of artificial situation, the hyperreality of Miami. Can you talk about those origins?
For me, it's, the work has sort of evolved a lot in the last few years, but where it started off with, and the work I first showed at the Museum of Contemporary Art was a series I called the Slim Fast silhouettes, which were basically these silhouettes of figures that I painted using Slim Fast, like the weight loss drink, as the material. And for me, it was sort of a reaction to always being this sort of skinny boy cliche, and you know, growing up in a time where in the 80s and early 90s, the ideal of beauty was the Abercrombie and Fitch like muscle guy. And so for me, growing up in Miami, like I never really felt like the attractive one. So when it finally, in the late 90s, Calvin Klein and that sort of idea of the waif came around, I finally felt like I was part of an attractive group, like something to aspire to. So for me, like Miami, growing up in Miami, so much of it was that sort of superficial beauty and sort of dealing with that and the whole notion of like, where do you fit into that aesthetic? So, so for me, I think a lot of the work stems from that idea of sort of not knowing where you are and where to place yourself in the context of your surroundings. So for me, Miami's always been my home, but at the same time, you know, I love being here, but I want to leave the moment I get here sometimes, which is really strange, but, you know, it's,
Well, you know, one of the things, I don't know if we ever talked about, the idea that you use Slim Fast, and in which case you took the granulations of powdered Slim Fast and mixed it with water, and it became your medium. But the fact that you used Slim Fast, did that ever have any relationship to Joseph Beuys using fat?
Absolutely. Like my first sort of love affair with art was I saw a small show of Joseph Beuys at the Miami Art Museum, and like it actually was the first time I'd ever walked into a museum, and the first show happened to be a Joseph Beuys show, and they had one of the fat corners, which was basically just a pile of fat in a corner. So my reaction to that piece actually was a piece I did called Fat Free Corner, which was just a pile of powdered Slim Fast in the corner, but also mixed with Felix Gonzalez Torres candy piles. So I had the little scoop, so if you wanted to, you could take some Slim Fast for yourself, which was kind of gross, but you know, it kind of congealed in the corner, which made it, you know, not so attractive, but yeah, I think a lot of that was about just the idea of using a material that describes yourself as well, like paint, you know.
Self-mythologizing.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Which does tie it in with Joseph Beuys. Now, you
Mm-hmm.
also, I mean, you were very fortunate. You know, a lot of people say, well, why was there so many great Miami artists in the 90s? And, you know, part of it is that we have had for a long time a great art magnet program in the public schools. And you went to the magnet program?
Yeah, I started going to what you could call art school in the 7th grade, you know. So by the time I got out of New World High School, I was doing 4 hours a day, every day of art, which most kids don't get the opportunity to do. So when I went to go to college, proper art school, I lasted all of 1 semester, you know, at Cooper Union in New York, because I was just sort of tired of it at that point. Like, Cooper's a great school, but the first day of drawing class, they made you draw ellipses for 8 hours, you know, because they break you down to like, you don't know anything, you have to start from scratch, and I was ready to go, so I just was done with art school. You know?
Right. But it was
saved me some money too. You know?
But it was such an amazing time, because I think art school isn't just about, you know, going and having lessons for. It's the peer group that you're surrounded with, and
I'm still friends with tons of people I met there, but
yeah.
the conversations I had outside of it were more important to me than in the classroom at the end of the day. But,
and I think that was really where the richness of the Miami artist scene came out of, was this amazing group that was all going to school at the same time here in Miami, and forming a kind of community and conversation and support
it went from
group.
being self-sufficient amongst the artists to actually, you know, having people pay attention to it, like yourself, you know. So that was the big change, I think, in Miami, was that moment when, you know, people like yourself or Fred like started to actually notice that there were young people doing things. Because most other cities, you know, youth kind of rules, but in Miami, I think there was still this sort of tradition of art being, you know, Miami's a place for Latin American art or something, and they didn't really look towards what was happening, you know, right in front of them to an extent. So I think that's one thing that's changed dramatically with Miami, is like there is actually a base of young people doing creative things and getting attention for it finally.
Well, that's you know, people ask me, you know, how do I pick young artists and shows, and you're a really good example. I went to visit an artist in Miami who I was actually working on with the catalog essay for the exhibition Making Art in Miami, and it was G. Moreno, and he had no idea who was going to be in the show, because I was keeping the list, you know, a secret until basically the day we opened up. And this is 1999, and on his walls in his house, there were some of your drawings, and I right away, I had never met you, and I said to Gene, who is this artist? Tell him he must come to see me immediately. Not knowing you don't have a car, you still don't drive.
I still don't drive, like, which is...
And you took, 3 buses and walked to come to my office, and, you know, after meeting you and seeing more of your work, it was, the kid was in the show. And was one of the really strong works of the Miami artists in the show.
So, that was that show for me, I kind of, almost in a way, like, fought to be in it. I was like, you know, like, I really want to be in this, Bonnie. And for me, it was important to sort of, because it was kind of chronicling that moment in Miami, like, these are sort of the pack, you know. So I definitely wanted to be part of that brat pack to an extent, you know.
And you made a work for that exhibition, besides all the Slim Fast drawings that we showed. You made a wonderful work with silhouettes. You want to talk a little bit about that piece, which is gone because it was just an ephemeral piece.
What you call it? I don't know if they can restart the slides, but anyway, but there's an image up there. But the work I made for the show, it was a show called, the title of the show was It's Supernatural, sort of a pun in a way, because it's super and then natural, like supernatural meaning like ghosts and spirits, but also referencing the fact that, like, to me, like, homosexuality was supernatural, you know? And so the show consisted of all these drawings in a darkened room that were based on the Hardy Boys series. So for me, the Hardy Boys were always this sort of funny thing to me, because it's this blonde boy and a dark-haired boy, and, like, they're, you know, solving mysteries together, you know? But the real mystery is that they're probably, you know? So there was always that weirdness with the Hardy Boys for me. Like, growing up, I read Nancy Drew, actually, because I didn't have the Hardy Boys, but So all the drawings had that illustrative quality, but they had these, you know, sort of hidden undertones of something else in the Hardy Boy drawings. And in the middle of the room, there was this, I constructed this clubhouse. It was called No Girls Allowed, and from the outside, it looked like a regular, you know, kids like rec room, like all wooden boarded up and stuff. But when you peeked inside through the door slot, it was all modernist interior with like copies of like Men's Vogue and, you know, all this like fancy
martini
stuff. Martini glasses and things like that. But for me, it was that idea of coding and like sort of hiding yourself. Like growing up, it's the equivalent of like, you know, a young gay kid putting like a Madonna record inside of like an AC/DC record, so I like hide it from their parents, you know. It's like, I don't listen to Madonna, you know? So that idea of I always called it the Trojan Horse for sissies, you know. It's like, you know, from the outside it looks like a regular kid's cabin, but when you peek inside, it's like this mysterious little play zone for young homosexuals, you know.
And that was the solo show we did for you in 2002, and there was also some other wonderful things about it in that the show itself was mystery. It was dark.
Yeah, you had to walk around. That was your idea, actually. We had these drawings around the room, but I wanted the cabin to be sort of lit from the interior, but no one could see the drawings. So you suggested, like, well, Hardy Boys, just get out some flashlights. So you had to actually see the drawings with flashlights in the show, which was kind of fun.
And I knew at that when we were preparing for that show. That you were definitely a 2D person because, you know, it was his first installation piece, and I asked him to make a drawing so that we could construct it, and he draws a house. And I said, well, you know, we're making a three-dimensional work. We need depth.
Yeah, I was like, oh, yeah, how wide is it? Yeah, that's probably important.
And of course, at the end, it all got destroyed, but we have great pictures of it, and maybe someday we'll recreate it.
Yeah, I'd like to do that.
But also, you know, at those early works, what was interesting was this idea, you know, you touched on it a little bit about the Hardy Boy illustration, that your original way of working was to appropriate a different type of style, almost like the way Raymond Pettibone works. He appropriates illustrative styles. It's not like it's a style he created himself. Right. You were doing a similar approach.
I think for me, I mean, early on it was, you know, you can't help but get compared to certain people, especially when you're a young artist. Like, I can't tell you the amount of times I've been told, like, oh, Karen Killimnick or Elizabeth Payton, you know, both artists I like and admire, but it was never my intention to sort of just be that. So for me, the way I like to work is I look at so much art in general that my work method is to sample so many different artists that at one point it becomes such a cluster of all these influences that it becomes your own aesthetic. Like, it's almost like resampling a record, like making, you know, a lot of my good friends in Detroit where I am now are musicians, and they get asked to do remixes of albums by other artists, and sometimes they do a remix that's better than the original. So that's sort of what I'm aiming for, is like, you know, that's a Rothko, let me remix a Rothko, you know, mix it with a Twombly and this and that. So for me, that's where, at the end of the day, my aesthetic is basically sampling it so much that it's not recognizably something else.
Yeah, now we look at a work by you and you right away say it's a Hernan Bas, not you know, appropriated style of the Hardy Boys illustration, right? So now when we were working back in those days in 2002, you were still at that time, I mean, most of the work you were doing was works on paper. Right. And you were very comfortable with works on paper, and you were struggling to find a way to paint on canvas. I mean, something you really wanted to do. And while we were working on the exhibition you had, I remember this beautiful canvas. It was like Black Mountain with figures in it. And that, but you were, you know, you still weren't satisfied. What was the breakthrough for you to get from the works on paper to the canvas?
For me, it was always more, in a way, almost always about space as well, because I went from working in my bedroom, like on the floor, literally, on these works on paper, and then from there I went, you know, to a table for slightly larger drawings, and then from there I went to an easel, which I never thought I'd paint on an easel. I always thought it was cheesy for some reason. I have no idea why, but like, just the idea of like, oh, you know. But and then from the easel it gone to the wall, and it's just sort of naturally progressed to larger works, but.
But still, the technique of painting, I mean, that was something you didn't really learn in school.
Right.
Was
I mean, also for me,
it
was, for me, the earlier works were a kind of a conceptual effort, and they looked kind of like illustration, and referenced certain things, but to me it was a means to a conceptual end, to make an actual image of something. But over time, I actually fell in love with the actual art of, or act of painting. And I think when I finally got comfortable with the sort of nature of brushes and, you know, the bravado of it, is when I really felt that I kind of could finally go towards canvas and be a little more traditional and, you know, less conceptual about it. And like now I can make a painting that's almost just about painting, you know,
which is
which
conceptual
is
in a way.
Yeah, that's true.
And then, you know, you very, you know, the success that you received right after, you know, really coinciding with our shows, and
right.
You received a really important residency in France at Giverny. And you came back a strong painter, I think, from that.
Yeah, that was, I did a residency in 2005 in Giverny, France. It was basically like Monet's estate. So it gave us, you know, we got a studio and we had keys to Monet's garden and the water lily pond. And just living in Europe too for the first time for several months was a big thing from like a, you know, boy from Miami. Oh, this is the clubhouse actually on the image. That's the interior. But for me, that really changed sort of my understanding of the history of painting too, because I really wanted to emulate not necessarily contemporary art, but I wanted to, like, I would go to the Gustave Moreau Museum like every weekend in Paris when I was there, and things like that, but also just the sort of sense of history. In Miami, you don't have a whole lot of history. Like, oh, an old building here is like 80 years old, you know? So being in Europe for the first time, it really gave me that sense of history and fantasy, and like I felt like being in Giverny, like you could, you know, any minute now I could see like a ferry walking by, or like, you know, trolls walking in the hills, you know. It had that sense of fantasy about it that I never really got in Miami, so I forgot what the question was. But
no, I mean, that it seemed to be that it was at that point you really became accomplished as a painter, was being in Europe and having access to art history and the time to really work on the craft of painting itself.
Right. Exactly. Speaking of fairies, actually these images are a series I did just in Detroit. There's people always joke that, you know, Hernan, he just paints a bunch of fairies, you know, so I just decided, like, okay, I'll give you fairies. So I did a series called A Bunch of Fairies, where I just took my images of the boys I painted and added fairy wings and, like, inserted them into, like, the landscape of Detroit. But they're pretty fun. But anyway.
Yeah. Now then, when did you leave for Detroit?
Detroit, I officially living there since the end of 2009, basically. But I think I love Miami, but I kind of just needed a big change in general. Like, I've lived here, grew up here for most of my life, so almost back to going to Giverny. Like, you know, after a certain point, just your mind sort of stalls. So I just needed some kind of change that would just get me going and, you know, on a different path, basically. Like, I was feeling a little stagnant in Miami, unfortunately. But,
and is there much of an artistic scene there, or are you more involved with the music scene?
I try not to be involved in the scene at all, to be honest. Because I mean, one of the reasons I left Miami was because there was such a scene brewing that it became a little overwhelming for me. So I always call going to Detroit, it's like my equivalent of going, you know, to my cabin in the woods, like Thoreau, you know. Just this, I needed to get away, and you know, at a certain point in Miami, people were knocking on the studio door and like asking to come in, and I never even met them, and it just got to be a little weird. It's like, okay, you know, make an appointment, you know. So I mean, Detroit's great because you have to really like me to come visit me in Detroit. You know? Like, it's an effort to go to Detroit, you know. So for me, it's that sort of quiet, and you know, I've painted more in the last 2 years than I have in the 6 years before that in Miami. Like, I got so much work done.
And the
really
scale
nice.
has grown so much.
Yeah,
also.
and the space. I mean, you can't beat Detroit for real estate. I mean, the studios are, you know, for what I paid in rent for 1 year of a studio in Miami, that same amount of money, I bought the building in Detroit where my studio is. Like, so you can't really beat that.
Yeah, but what's the resale value?
Yeah, well, yeah. It's not about it's just about space, you know. And I actually just ran out of space in that studio, so I just bought another building down the street. You know, it's just like, oh, might as well buy a building. It's Detroit. You know?
Well, what I've also noticed is so much. I mean, your work really has become about the figure in the landscape, and and in many of the more recent works, the lone figure in the landscape. And you know, have you thought about that aspect of the work?
I never thought, a lot of people ask me, like, you know, is that you in the picture? Because it's usually this solitary figure. And I've always said, like, no, it's not really me. It's not really a fantasy of mine or a place I want to be. But since I moved to Detroit, I've felt a little bit more like that's kind of might be accurate, because, you know, I kind of do feel like the lone figure in the woods at times in Detroit. But Yeah.
And the painting that's at Fred Snitzer's booth right around the corner, I was just looking at it, there's like elements with the way that the trees are moving. It reminds me a lot of Charles Birch Field's sort of, they're not surreal, but symbolic landscapes.
Right.
And but also, if you took the figure out completely, it's basically an abstract painting.
Right. That's the fun thing with, I mean, this image, for example, is a really good example, but I think for me, landscape lends itself so easily to abstraction. Like if you look at someone like Birch Field, like same thing, you could kind of crop some Birch Fields in their abstract paintings too. But when I deal with these abstractions, it just makes it funner and easier to do a landscape because, you know, a swath of green, you know, that's a hillside, you know, but when in reality it's just a swath of green paint. So that way that abstraction can just, you know, bleed into figuration. People always want to see something in abstraction too, so if you just give them little hints, you know, then basically just sells the story for you.
and also thinking the texture and the, you know, it's come so far from the thinned down